Hey everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and we're visiting in on a number of my bins today. These ones here on the top shelf are my oldest bins. So I usually arrange my bins in sort of an order that shows me quickly where the oldest bin is, and in my case it's this one over here, and then wrapping around clockwise until you get your way around to the newest bin. So in my case, my newest bin down here is 7 days old. And it's one of the bins that we're going to be working on. And that's going to be in conjunction with my three oldest bins. Here, the oldest one being 213 days old. And up until 2 weeks ago, 199 days was my record for the longest bin. But at this point, I believe that both of these have exceeded 199 days in age. And as you can imagine, they're near the end of their life cycle. And I've been working on trying to get the castings ready for harvest and getting them situated into other bins to continue their work so that the casting can be used in my garden soon, because it's spring and it's going to be time to plant the garden soon, so these castings are going to come in really handy in a little while. Let me bring you a little bit closer just to show you what's happening here. On the tops of these oldest containers, you can see that there's here it's easiest to see because the plastic is right on top, but underneath these pieces of paper as well there's plastic. The plastic creating sort of a vapor barrier, allowing for any evaporating moisture to condense and collect and recirculate right underneath that plastic, whereas the material out here on the far end is covered only with a piece of paper, allowing it to dry out a little bit and maybe become a little bit less appealing of a place for the worms to continue to remain. And over the past number of weeks, we've, in each case that we've reloaded these feeding zones out here on the edge, we've always also extracted worms, with which we had launched both of these new bins, and more recently we had reinforced the population of this bin with additional worms. I was really liking the way things were progressing in this bin right here. It had received 3 injections of worms to increase its population to where it is today. I really liked the results of that, so I'm going to mimic that to a degree on this bin here as well. So following suit with what happened here on its 1 week birthday, 7 days after the bin was launched with approximately 1,000 worms, we came over here, we got volunteer worms out of these oldest bins, out of their feeding zones, and we released them into here to help out the original 1,000. We loaded about another 1,000 on day 7, and in the case of this newest bin, it too is now at age 7 days. And since I really liked the results of what happened over here, I'm going to start mimicking it here, so that we're going to have a couple bins that are going to be maintained in tandem with one another for the most part. So I'm going to try to follow suit with what happened here in this newest bin to see if we get the favorable results that we've already observed in this bin here. So that's going to start with the removal of worms from these bins, and then eventually launching them into this bin to reunite them with their cousins who had been moved over there a week earlier. At the same time, we're going to have to also evaluate how close these 3 bins here are to being finished, and what we could do as far as next steps are concerned to bring closure to their life cycles, to harvest the castings, make sure all the worms we've got in them have been relocated, and get these tubs ready for another batch in the near future. So I'm going to start with getting these out on the bench, start extracting some worms, and then what happens after that will be decided on based on what we see in here. So let's get to work. So we'll begin with the oldest of my bins. So like I said, under this paper here is this piece of plastic, and the plastic's job has been to sort of behave as the terrarium top to capture any sort of moisture trying to evaporate out. And as you can see, it's doing a decent job. It's a piece of sort of paper bag type material. And then here too, obviously, the moisture is collecting over the feeding zone. And I can already see there's a nice pitch here suggesting that a certain amount of the food that was given to them last time has been depleted, driving the level down. Because usually we'll leave things fairly level here, and it's quite clear when the material surface drops. So with all this extra moisture, I'm just taking special care to make sure I don't inadvertently drag a worm out of this nice moist habitat out into the dry world on the tabletop to end up injuring or hurting them with the dryness. So down here is where our focus is going to be to pull out worms, although it's not a single-minded focus. The other thing of interest, obviously, is to see if these castings have yet been depopulated and if they're ready for harvest. So the drying is working. You can see that a lot of the material here on the surface is becoming nice and dry with only that one sheet of newspaper covering it. But usually, like with most compost, you don't have to go far to get down to where the nice moist material is. So I'm going to just peel it back to show, once you get the dry stuff out of the way, you've already got some really nice castings here. And the hope is that if we examine these castings, that we'll find a minimal number of worms in them. Because we've been allowing it to get a little bit more dry, we've been letting it make it, the idea being that it becomes a little bit more crumbly and easier to handle if we should decide to run it through the sifter. I mean, I'm not a commercial operation here. I'm not trying to make this stuff look perfect. If I were, then I would definitely be running it through a sifter, but for my purposes, putting it in the garden like this with little scraps of leaves and remaining lingering materials, you know, organic materials within the compost, it's not a problem. You know, I don't see any problem with having little particles this size in my compost if I'm going to use it in the garden. And I'm not finding any worms. I mean, I don't know if you spotted any while I was here gabbing. Sometimes I don't pay that close attention, but I've not seen one worm. And it makes sense too, because normally worms wouldn't want to be in material that's this dry. The material definitely has dried out considerably. So I've got a feeling that this thing is almost at the point where we might be able to close up shop here and consider this as a done batch. It's got such a nice earthy smell to it once you start stirring it up a little bit. Every time I look around, I saw like this, for example, the colors of it against the brown. It looks like a worm, doesn't it, with the red printing on it? So I thought, oh darn, we've got worms in here still, but so far nothing. So I'm thinking maybe pushing some of this uncomposted material over here where we know the worms and the action is, because then maybe we'll give that stuff a chance in its new location to continue breaking down. But if some of this stuff remains here in the finished compost, that's fine. So now the real question is, at which point can we consider this material as truly done? Because you know, at some point over here in the feeding zone is where all the worms are hanging out. So I'm wondering if it'll be possible to sort of determine where that cutoff point is. So now here, as we get closer to where the feeding zone is and where the terrarium top and the moisture collection was happening, the material is getting more moist, meaning it's probably realistic to expect that we're going to start finding worms in the material. So we have found one, as you saw there a moment ago, and I did move that one worm over on top of the feeding zone. But now, you know, I'm not going to go through the exercise of trying to pick out every single worm in this material, because this material could probably still use a little bit of working. You know, obviously, all these little bits and pieces, if there's still worms in this material, and if the material's not going straight out into the garden, then hopefully those worms will continue to break down this material into a much more fine batch of castings. So here's my game plan. Definitely tell me if you agree or disagree. Maybe more importantly, if you disagree, why. But I'm thinking that it's time to take these castings and set them aside, take them out of circulation, no more feedings. We're going to consider this as a done batch. I'm starting to make my way pretty close over to the feeding zone, and I'm still hardly encountering any worms. I mean, here and there I'm finding a worm, and if they stay in the material, that's fine. But I'd like to get to the point where I could treat everything else that's over here as ready to be relocated. Move the worms, the food, everything that's in here right over into that new bin. So here too, we're just going to keep chipping away at what appears to be, for the most part, finished castings. If we grab a worm or two on the way over, that's only a good thing, because we'll want some workers remaining in this material to let them continue breaking down anything that's still in it. And then we'll have the option to try to maybe either bait out those worms, as well as any worms that might be still in cocoons and yet to hatch out. So it's probably fair to expect that this material has a bunch of cocoons in it. And if that is the case, then within a few weeks we should expect to see, you know, baby worms emerging from those cocoons, who will also be, you know, some additional hungry mouths to help out with the breakdown of the material in this bin. So at this point I'm encountering larger chunks of food items surrounded by worms, breaking it all down. So at this point I don't think I'm going to get many more handfuls of material that's mainly castings. I think at this point we're really getting close to where the mob is going to be, the majority of the worms in this bin right here. So we've not yet examined what's happening in here, but I'm going to assume, because for the past 8 weeks only this side has been getting fed, that the majority of the worms that were still in this container are going to be over here. However, the little plastic tub that I had set aside, into which I had planned to put this just doesn't seem big enough. I'm starting to think I might need something a little bit larger. So let me get something else. Here we go. Let's go with this. This is like the bottom half of what I believe was about a 5-gallon bucket. So I think we're going to have plenty of space in here for these little guys to get moved over into. So let's see if we can get a better view of what's happening here as we do it. But let's also try not to make a huge mess in the process. I guess I'll try to hang it over a little bit like this, so that as I scoop over, if I miss anything, then it doesn't go on the table. Now, even though there was sort of a terrarium effect being induced over here, I'm definitely feeling the dryness in this material too. So even though it's not a perfect world over here where the feedings were occurring, it's definitely more favorable in terms of moisture than back over here. So it's not surprising that we're finding so many worms mixed into this stuff over here. Okay, and I think that's going to make it official. I'm going to either relocate this material into a more shallow tub or a smaller container to allow it to go through a period of rest. I'll cover the entire surface with plastic this time, so that the entire surface gets the returned evaporated moisture collecting down on it across the entire surface, and hopefully that continued circulation of moisture will make it nice and cozy in here for these little guys to continue working down the material that's in this. But let's just make sure we don't have any worms on the brink of climbing out, because then they'll be doomed. So let's set this aside. I think we're in good shape with this. And as far as this is concerned, until such a time that we find a smaller container into which we can relocate the material to go through its finishing. I'll just spread it out evenly here. I guess the other option might have been to really, go ahead and run this stuff through a sifter and try to really pull out anything larger. And then they would really be required to work down the tiny remaining particles. All right, this looks fine. I'm gonna get this all covered right back up the way we had it previously. The only thing, like I mentioned earlier, is gonna be that I'm not focusing the water retention any longer. Let's not go crazy thinking about this. Let's leave everything the way it is. Most importantly, getting this on the top as spread out across the entire top surface as possible to try to promote the moisture to collect all across the top. I really want them to really continue working the material. So this will be good for now. I'll get this thing covered up with those other pieces of cardboard that we had. I mean, we've really removed the majority of the worms at this point. And usually when that occurs, I'll usually sort of reclassify this bin as sort of a resting bin and like a finishing bin. So maybe 2/13 will in fact be the finish date for this. I'll try to decide on how to best record this going forward. But let's get to the next bin and continue with this. Similar setup here. This paper is really just covering this plastic that's doing the job of retaining moisture. I believe here we had found recently that the materials are really getting pretty heavily deteriorated from being in here with the worms working it down. But I don't see any worms on this, so I think we're safe setting it aside. And then here we do have one worm on the surface that we're going to try to encourage that worm to go back down. Here's another one. Let's see, do we miss anybody? We've got the majority of our worms. If we missed anyone, hopefully they don't suffer too much out here in the dry. And here we have what appears to be a fairly new coffee filter, indicating for us where the last feeding had occurred, which was over here. Like I said, very similar, both bins. But the real question is, are we possibly in a situation to call it quits with this bin as well? Which would be kind of neat if it was the case. So if that is the case, let's anticipate that that might be the case. Let's take a lot of this uncomposted material along the surface and move it over to the right, because then that'll just remain with the worms to be relocated into another active bin for ongoing work and processing. I guess if we're really lucky, we're going to start poking around in here and find some really nice castings that is devoid of any worms. Wow, isn't that nice? The castings on this far edge are a lot more moist than the castings that we harvested out of the other bin. And since it was so moist when I first ran my fingers down into it, I did sort of anticipate seeing worms once I turned it over. But I'm not finding any. Wow, this is awesome. Can we really bring closure to 2 bins today? Oh man, that would be awesome. Like we've been doing, if I encounter something large, it'll be nice to anticipate that this is stuff that we can consider as finished castings. So let's follow suit with what we've been doing till now and move anything like that over to where the action's going to be. Wow, this is great. Well, and like we said earlier, even if this material still has some worms in it, it's not the end of the world, because we're going to anticipate that there's probably still a bunch of worm eggs, worm cocoons in this material that have yet to hatch out, meaning that at least 3 or 4 weeks should go by first to see if there's any baby worms emerging from those cocoons, or not, or just, take the stuff straight out into your garden and use it as is. All those worms can only do good out in your garden. We're going to do the same here. We're going to try to find that point where we can still consider what we're shoveling off to the side as pretty much pure castings, and then we're going to scoop out all the rest. And then we'll give this stuff some time to rest as well. Let the worms finish down all the little remaining lingering bits that we don't pick out. The really small, minute, minuscule particles. We'll once again cover up the entire surface to try to promote that reclaiming of moisture, so that the worms get really comfortable and break everything that remains down. So now we're getting to the point where there's like some larger chunks of stuff surfacing much more rapidly, which means it's either food items or bedding from these last few horizontal migration feeding attempts. Mostly really broken down, but here and there a scrap of this, a scrap of that. We'll try to keep it here with the active material. So let's see how much more. I'm also trying to do it in a way that I do bring over a fair amount of worms to continue the work in this material. I'm not so interested in having castings only here. I'm definitely interested in having some workers remain in the material so that they'll be there to, you know, continue breaking down the food that's still in here, and so that there's, you know, someone around to greet the baby worms when they start emerging from their cocoons. But I think that's a pretty decent split. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to treat this as finished stuff as well, and this stuff we're going to scoop right out and throw it into here along with the other ones. Let's slide it over again like we did before. And just looking at it, I feel like we're going to get pretty close to filling this yellow bucket. So I'm wondering if we're even going to have room to try to round up volunteers out of that third bin. Wow, this whole thing in my hand is just moving. Just a huge mass of worms. There's all kinds of food bits in here too from the last feeding, which was only about a week ago. Bedding materials. So this must be really cozy for them. All kinds of cozy, delicious foodstuffs to continue their activity in. I bet a lot of these little guys wouldn't even know anything had changed, since I'm sort of bringing their current locations over as is, along with the worms. You can definitely see there's a good amount of worms starting to collect in this container, and I've got very little room remaining in here to bring any more over. And you know, I mean, if you compare what we're doing here today to the last few migrations of worms from these bins over into that other new bin, this is a completely different situation here. We are bringing over many, many more worms here. So I am really starting to rethink whether we want to mess with going into the third bin to do this, because this going into that new bin of mine is going to pretty much almost fill up that new bin. I don't even know if we're going to have room for another batch of worms coming out of there. So let's just set these little guys aside. We'll have to flip a coin or decide what to do soon, because we're almost done here. This is also, at this point, what I would almost consider finished material. But since we're still a few weeks away from planting time, this material can certainly sit for a little bit longer, and hopefully the remaining residents will just continue to feed on the material that's in here and continue to break it down into a really nice, fine batch of vermicompost for the garden. Yeah, I like what I'm seeing here. Really beautiful stuff. This is a great opportunity now too to pick out any larger chunks of bedding or food that's in here. It's a pretty hefty red wiggler right there. Huh. A couple of these little guys. They're not really long, but they're very thick compared to some of the other worms nearby, just relative to their size. So let's try to get this stuff leveled out here. Not bad. And for now, we're going to cover it up I don't think we really need this feeding zone anymore because we don't have a feeding zone. So we'll just preserve that and see if we can find another use for it. We're going to just cover up here very much the way we found it. Again, trying to use the entire surface as our terrarium environment now, rather than just one or the other edge of the bin. So the plastic that was originally very much on the edge, we're going to just spread it out across the entire top surface. I mean, I might even just take both of these bins if I really decide that today is the end of both of these bins, now that the populations have been moved out. I might just place both the contents of both of these two bins that we just bought closure to, and just create one large tub of material that's just sort of in its finishing mode. And maybe at some point in the future we could use a banana or something to try to bait out the remaining worms in a few weeks. But I'll decide what to do with this stuff later. For now, let's just set it aside. Alrighty, wow, this bin. Like I said, I don't know what to do, you know. I mean, we've been trying to encourage the worms in this bin, just like the other two bins, to make their way over to this side. This is the youngest of the three, though, so this bin is definitely not as old as the last two bins that we worked on. Those two bins are either 200 days old or 213 days old or something like that. So this bin is not quite at that age yet, but it is very full. It's a very full bin and an extremely highly populated bin. Lots and lots of worms in this bin. So I wouldn't be surprised to find lots and lots of worms in this feeding zone over here on the edge. Come on, buddy, stay. So let's see, I guess we're definitely not going to have an opportunity today, in this case, I think, to harvest this bin, because I do remember this material still being very heavily populated with worms, and you can still see fairly large chunks. Although the drying effort is working, you can see the stuff on the top surface is definitely dry. You know, as long as we're in here, let's go ahead and give the material, if nothing else, a little bit of an aeration, as well as an inspection. It's a lot more moist than what we saw in the other two bins, and it's clearly a lot more heavily populated, all the way out to the far edge still. So I believe it will help for us to jostle the material around a little bit, create some air pockets down in there, give the stuff a chance to dry out a little bit more thoroughly, move some of the really dry stuff that's on the surface down into the material. I'm also going to see if I could just pile it up a little bit, because, you know, if there is a chance for us to maybe relocate at least a few handfuls of worms from this one, we might as well. So, I mean, that was the whole reason for setting up these horizontal migrations in the first place. So to have them all just sitting there waiting to be pulled out and not doing so, it seems kind of a shame. But as you can see, as I'm nudging stuff over to the edge, I'm already surpassing the level of the edge of the bin. So I'm really full on this container. There's really no room to add anything, especially if you're not removing anything. So I am kind of hoping that we can maybe reach into this very far end and grab ourselves a few handfuls of worms before we put this bin back up on the shelf to continue. And I am thinking that we might want to also kind of reload this feeding zone to continue encouraging the worms to keep working their way over to here. So I think as I encounter some of these larger chunks of bedding, I'm going to set them aside so that we can add a little bit more food down into here after we're done, before we reset and we let them resume work. I'm definitely encountering large chunks of food as my fingers reach down into these previous feeding zones. The very last feeding zone will be all the way on the far edge, but as you work your way in over the past 8 weeks, I don't know how many horizontal feedings have occurred on this edge. A lot of it's already very heavily broken down, but as we make our way to the far end over here, we're going to start encountering a lot more material that's really not that old and hasn't really been broken down too much. But I got a feeling that that's where we're also going to find a bunch of worms. So let's just do this. Let's wow, so heavy. I'm going to bring this thing back. We're just going to max this thing out. We're going to pile in as many worms as we can, and make a little bit of space in here just so we can reset the feeding zone. Here in this bin, looks like we're also going to be bringing out a bunch of food items too as we relocate handfuls of worms. They're still very much into their food. The food's not yet really broken down much. So I almost feel like it's difficult to bring many over without actually bringing large chunks of food too, which isn't a really big problem, right? Because if I do that, they'll just dive out of the material down, and then I could scoop out some of those larger food chunks and return them over here into this feeding zone. Or they can just stay here with the worms and go over into the other bin. So they have some good food that's already been started that they can just continue eating. Just some really big chunks of, like, you know, mango seed here. I think I felt a second mango seed floating around in here too. Stuff that's definitely not going to break down in here. I wonder if it should go over as well. And maybe we'll just start moving some of these really big pieces that are not going to break down over here in the remaining time. So these 2 mango seeds, we'll just send them over with the worms. Stuff like this, whatever this is, you know, it's going to mush. They'll have easy access to that. Let them just continue working on that sort of stuff in here as we try to set up a new spot for a refreshed feeding zone down here for them to continue their work. And I'm even questioning about whether or not I want to add much food, because, you know, you saw it, it's all food, it's all packed in there. All this material that they're occupying is still definitely edible food. So maybe what we can do is just continue using what exists here already rather than adding more food. And just push it over to the edge, and when we start leveling off, we'll end up with a much lower level. Not much lower level, but, you know, a little bit of a lower level because of what we've removed. Stuff is definitely very muddy. So yeah, let's consider this as all the worms that we're extracting today, and it's a lot. I mean, it is a lot. And this bin is not finishing today. No way. It's definitely going to need more time to continue, and I guess I'll just throw these few little chunks of paper bedding material that we encountered over there on the far edge. I'll try to grab what appears to be mainly large food chunks and move them back out here to the feeding zone. Find any other ones clearly visible out here. And the rest of this is all kind of just mush. Here and there you find a banana stem, something a little bit larger, a little bit tougher. Those are the sort of things that are not going to be broken down quite yet, although they're definitely getting there. So I'm just using this as an opportunity to use my fingers, sort of rake through the material, find those lingering large pieces of food that are out here, concentrate them all into the far edge where we're going to continue feeding. This is cool, it's a peach pit. So if nothing else, I think, you know, the periodic jostling of the material going forward might help this stuff dry out a little bit, become a little bit more crumbly. At the present time, it's a little bit too muddy. Although out here on the far edge, over here where it's had a chance to dry a little bit, it's not as muddy. So, you know, in time it'll all improve. The worms will also start sensing that it's drying over time, and they'll go looking for more cozy areas in the bin, and that cozy area is going to be over here where the food and the moisture is. So I've almost leveled this off for the most part. I've picked as many of the larger food chunks out as I was sifting through and tried to move them back over to where the feeding zone was. And I think before we wrap up, we are going to give this bin a feeding. And that feeding is going to consist of this. I actually went into my little collection of seedlings, peppers and tomatoes. And I did a little bit of thinning yesterday and trimming. So all of this I'm going to just go ahead and place right here on top of the bin's feeding zone. I don't even know if I would count this as food or bedding or what, but I think the worms are going to like it. I love that smell of the tomato stems and leaves, the smell that there is when you move it around and break the stems and stuff, or even when you just touch the leaves. Got that really cool tomato smell. So I got a feeling the worms are going to really enjoy this stuff. Next time we come in here, I bet you this stuff is going to be crawling with worms. Out of the 3 bins that I thought we were originally just going to pull volunteers from, we've actually now bought a close to 2 of those 3 bins, and I think I am going to mark those 2 other bins as completed as of today, with a new record holder of 213 days of age on the first one that we depopulated. And I guess just in terms of where to store that stuff while it continues to wind down, I'm not quite sure. I might end up just combining the material in both of those completed bins into one finishing tub, free up one of those bins for other uses. And this one we'll just continue tracking. We'll continue trying to promote a really cozy space for them over on this edge, so that they'll continue to depopulate what appears to almost be finished castings out here on this side. So, what remains? Oh, I think I know. We still got a whole boatload of worms to release, so I believe that that's what most people are here to see. Let's get on to it. That's so weird. It's so funny when you grab your newest bin after you've just handled a couple of your oldest bins, what a huge difference in weight there is. So this bin, only being a week old, only has its initial build materials in it, as well as the originally launched batch of worms. It's not yet received its first feeding, and I think what we're going to add into this now is probably going to amount to potentially tripling or more the population in this bin. It's going to bring with it a huge amount of additional weight. So I don't think we're going to be surprised at how light this bin is anymore. I think we're actually going to be surprised at how heavy it is, considering it's my newest bin. So here we're finding a few worms chilling out on the surface, enjoying the moisture that's collecting under that plastic that was resting on top. So that's pretty cool. It's only moist down here in the middle. You know, the plastic that I'm using usually doesn't cover the entire surface. A lot of times the outer edges do have a chance to breathe, so that's what we're seeing here. A little bit drier on the far edges, but still, you know, look at that. You look around out there and it's worms right out to the corner, totally not minding. So even though I'm kind of assessing it as being dry, the worms obviously don't think so. And you don't have to go down deep to find material that's nice and comfortable for them. So I believe the dryness we're seeing is strictly on top. Okay, well, this should be interesting because I don't know if I've ever launched this many worms into a bin. I know I've I know I've used this in the past to extract worms from the bins and relocate them, but I don't know if I've ever gone this far to the top of the container. I mean, it's almost full. Seriously. So yeah, let's dump this thing and see what we got. Can't wait. Wow. It's like a huge tower. And I don't see any worms in the yellow container. We got them all. It's awesome. Good job. So I'm trying to carefully level this thing down, at least to a point where it's not above the outer rim of the bin. Because I don't want worms spilling out over the edge. All kinds of worms spilling out and material flying everywhere. So it looks like one of the things I came over is the stem of the pumpkin. That oldest bin that we just brought closure to was the bin that we used when we filmed the time lapse of the most recent little tiny pumpkin getting consumed. So I'm just keeping the larger items that we bought out of that bin, which was this piece of stem that was part of the pumpkin, as well as another piece of this stem, which I had originally trimmed off and removed so that we wouldn't have such a huge stem on the pumpkin. This seemed like it was enough. Mango seed is almost empty. It looks like they went ahead and they gobbled up what was inside. Now they're just eating the shell itself. You know, unless what was inside fell out. That's always possible too. I know we bought over a couple other mango seeds in the process. We bought over a lot of material from those two bins. You can see we're almost at the top edge of this container. There's not really a lot of room in here. I am looking forward to getting the worms completely done in those two older tubs, so I could reuse those tubs to relocate some of my populations into. This container is not going to take kindly to more loading of materials because it's almost at capacity at this point. Okay, well, a lot of times when we release my worms, they're in a much larger glob and they come out in a much more prominent way, and I sort of run a little fast motion replay of them squirming out of sight down into the material, but I don't think we've got that kind of a release here today. So I think we're not going to have such a dramatic clip in this video as we do in some of my other worm release videos. But hopefully we saw a satisfactory number of worms in the process of collecting these guys and recruiting them for this mission here. So let's get things covered up here. At some point soon, I'll have to come back into here and make sure that I've supplemented the food supply, because although the bin is a week old, it has not yet received its first feeding, other than the food that was placed into the bin when the bin was originally built, which wasn't all that much, especially considering how many worms we just added. So in a very short period of time, I believe we will be needing to add more food to this bin, because this is going to become a really active and hungry bin, I think, with all these worms in it. I don't know, what do you think? What's your guess? How many worms did we just launch off into here? If we estimate that we had originally launched this bin with 1,000, and then whatever number of worms came through in here, in addition to that, I mean, it makes me wonder if we might have something in the neighborhood of, what do you think? That thing was really heavy. But I'm also factoring in that we bought over a lot of food items. That had some weight to it as well, a lot of castings, which is also heavy material. So I'm going to estimate that the number of worms in here is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000. Do you agree? You think it's more? Do you think it's less? What do you think? So looking forward to hearing everyone's comments and stuff down in the comment section. So go ahead, type me a message, ask me a question, whatever you think. Love to hear from you. But that's it for today. Nothing more to do. Pretty much a mission accomplished. So let me get things cleaned up here. But that's boring. I won't keep you around for that. I'll just take this as an opportunity to say thank you. Thanks for sticking around and keeping me company. It's always nice to see what people have to say after I've done one of these, so I look forward to reading all of your comments. And as always, please remember to give me a like. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up to show that you liked it. It really helps a lot. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's really appreciated too. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.